causes of the changes. Okay. Now, not moving to the next slide. Yeah, okay. All right, as has already been said, two central questions have already been given about how the relationship is and politics more polarized. So let's move on. We're going to start back 100 years ago in the 1920s when the Republican Party dominated the government, and Calvin Coolidge was president under most of those years, and his famous slogan is, "Business of America is business." Voting alignments in the 1920s, the Republican Party, its main source of support was northern white Protestants, especially those who were rich and in rural areas and in small towns. And those groups gave the Republic a solid majority. They won all three presidential elections by landslides averaging 58% of the popular vote. The Democratic Party, on the other hand, drew support from some rather disparate groups: Catholics, Jews, and Southern whites. These groups were all poorer and were excluded from status. Okay, that's what they had in common. Southern whites were also committed to white supremacy, and most Democrats supported that policy. What's that? Changing. Okay, so there were racial minorities, primarily blacks. And blacks at that time voted strongly Republican. The Republican Party had ended slavery and instituted Reconstruction and was more favorable to blacks than the Democrats were. As far as the Democrats, Woodrow Wilson, who had just been president, illustrated their policies by segregating the city of Washington, D.C., which hadn't been policy before, and by firing the relatively few blacks who had jobs in the federal government. I want to comment, some of you may have noticed my capitalization of races, both black and white. And my reason is, as a colleague persuaded me, these really aren't accurate descriptions of skin color. They're really names we give to groups. Okay, so what were the major political issues dividing parties in the 1920s? Well, immigration, then as now, was an issue. The Republicans passed in 1924 a law imposing national quotas that effectively favored people from Northwest Europe, most of whom were Protestant. And who did it exclude? Well, most notably, it says we don't want more Jews, we don't want more Italians and other Southern Europeans. And of course, we don't want Asians and Latin Americans. Prohibition was another issue. The Republicans favored it, the Democrats opposed it. One reason for Democratic opposition is that both Catholics and Jews, who are part of its base, use wine, among other things, as part of religious rituals. And so shortly after Hoover was elected in 1928, the Depression started in 1929. And by 1932, economic output was down to 2/3 of 1929, with 25% unemployment. Contrast this with what we thought was bad when it was 10% in 2009, to which I might add, there wasn't unemployment insurance, and there usually weren't two wage owners in a house. Now, Hoover's response, based not on cruelty as much as that of conventional knowledge, was things fix themselves, but they didn't. Therefore, Roosevelt won by a landslide in 1932 with 57% of the popular vote and brought in a strongly Democratic Congress, something I might add that Biden does not have. The New Deal greatly increased involvement of the federal government in the economy for two different purposes. One was to stabilize capitalism in the financial system, and the other is to aid ordinary Americans. And as some New Dealers put it, trying to achieve Jeffersonian ends of greater equality by Hamiltonian means of a strong federal government. What were the major policies of the New Deal? Well, one was a lot of public spending to do two things. One is to create jobs, and the other is for infrastructure, roads, bridges, parks, dams, and other things, rural electrification. Okay. And, you've heard a lot about how our infrastructure is crumbling. Well, one reason for that is almost nothing since then. In fact, as you may have heard, the last major infrastructure project the federal government Security Act, which included not only the old age insurance, which many of us watching are right now benefiting from, but also unemployment insurance, and a federally subsidized programs for various needy people, including dependent children. All of this had the catch name welfare, which made it and was less widely accepted than these other programs. It also passed the Wagner Act, guaranteeing labor the right to collective bargaining, and to ensure the financial system ensured banks and regulation of securities. The effect of the New Deal provided help to cities and rural areas. It provided some improved job opportunities for Blacks, but the nation, the reason being it could not have gotten through the power of the Southern Bloc in Congress if it had. What were the political consequences of the New Deal? Basically jobs, but most were in the South and were not allowed to vote. So they weren't really important in terms of making the Democratic Party the majority.
Is he frozen for anyone else as well?
Yes.
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 Okay, it looks like he was removed from the Zoom call. So please stand by.
Was 1964. Yeah, to guarantee the votes to Blacks in the South in 1965. And there was a filibuster allowed, but this had enough Republican votes to pass despite that. LBJ and the Democrats also provided more aid, including welfare, to the poor, and they passed Medicare. This, again, was made possible by large Democratic majorities in Congress. Now, for the previous 20 years, the Republican Party had two very distinct wings in it. There's the moderate wing, which produced all the nominees, which basically accepted the New Deal, supported civil rights, at least in the South, and also basically favored avoiding war with the Soviet Union. By contrast, the more conservative wing opposed the New Deal, was not enthusiastic about civil rights, and wanted a more aggressive position against the Soviet Union to roll back communism. And they took control of the party in '64, they're winning primaries and other things, and they nominated Goldwater, who opposed the Civil Rights Act, who favored the end of Social Security, saw Medicare as freedom-destroying socialism, and was quite hawkish on foreign policy. Okay. Johnson won by a landslide of 61%, in part because of fear that Goldwater would get us into a war. Democrats went from getting 2/3 of the black vote earlier to over 90% of the black vote. But Southern whites started shifting to the Republicans. I say started because Johnson actually still won a bunch of Southern states on the basis of white votes. However, there were some major changing electoral fortunes about to happen. In 1932 and through 64, the Democrats won 7 of 9 presidential elections, the exception being Eisenhower's 2 victories. In 1968, Nixon narrowly defeated Humphrey. But those liberals who took comfort by the narrowness of Humphrey's loss were rudely awakened if they believed Kevin Phillips. And Kevin Phillips said this was a conservative landslide. If you take Nixon's 43% and George Wallace's 14%, you get 57% on the right. And he took these votes and carefully analyzed them and wrote a book calling The Emerging Republican Majority. And I didn't like what it was predicting, but it was correct. The Republicans won 5 of the 6 presidential elections in 1968 to 1988, all by comfortable margins for the right side of the spectrum, if you count 68. The important question is why? Now, Paul Krugman is some of you know him. He is both a Nobel Prize-winning economist and a frequent columnist for the New York Times. And his explanation for political change was very simple. Southern whites started voting Republican. Definitely correct, but there's more to it than that. Shortly after Johnson's victory, well, I should say that comment on the contrary, the Southern movement headed by King was steeped in nonviolence, at least nonviolence on the part of blacks who were assaulted by violent white mobs and police. However, in the North, parts of the black movement started using or at least condoning violence. And we had things like the urban ghetto riots in Detroit and other cities. The Kerner Commission report that came out in 1968 outlined the causes of the riot, such as black people's problems with police brutality, housing discrimination, segregated schools with poor facilities, and job discrimination. The liberal democratic response was basically, let's try to make the changes that Kerner Commission report says are necessary. And so some of the things they did were affirmative action in jobs and education for women and minorities, school busing for racial balance, and the ultimate goal being to improve education for blacks, and advocating open housing laws. The Republican response, Nixon and the rest, was not the opposite, which is to appeal to white resentment over racial issues, resentment over the riots, affirmative action, school busing, and at the same time, there was increasing crime and increasing welfare spending. Now, in the meantime, other social movements also appeared threatening conservative social values regarding cultural values, regarding patriotism, authority, and the work ethic, gender and sexuality, and also environment versus industry. And attitudes towards these movements have had a great and continuing effect on voting. In addition to this, of course, we had the Vietnam War. This increased frustration on both the left and the right. The left, who felt like we had no business being there in the first place and killing people, and the right, who said, why are we allowing this second-rate nation to defeat us? You know, we need to be tougher. While all of this is going on, we also have the growth of a counterculture that advocated and used recreational drugs and opposed conventional jobs and sexual monogamy, and whose high priest Timothy Leary said, turn on, tune in, drop out. So the Republicans, aside from race, appealed to resentment over the counterculture and the anti-war movement. So what was the response of white voters? Well, by the late 60s, a large majority of Southern whites supported the Republican Party in presidential elections. You know, as Krugman said, But in addition, many working class and middle class whites in the North deserted the Democrats on issues of welfare and crime. They felt that their taxes were paying for programs for the undeserving poor. So the gender and sexuality movements starting in the late 60s were one was women's rights, in other words, included job equality among other things, right to abortion, and rights for LGBT. Now, the first one, women's rights, initially was not highly partisan, at least insofar that Nixon initially supported the Equal Rights Amendment, and only later did it become under attack by people like Phyllis Schlafly and then the whole right wing. Then we move to 1980. Democrats had their one election during that period under Carter, but then Reagan won in 1980, and his platform promised lower taxes, especially for the rich, less regulation of business, and less government spending, especially for the poor. And he also promised to satisfy many demands of conservative evangelicals and other religious conservatives. Now, Reagan, like Goldwater, was primarily motivated by a desire to undo much of the New Deal and to oppose communism more aggressively. But he knew that opposing the New Deal, as Goldwater did, would not get him elected. So he de-emphasized his economic policies and emphasized improving a weakened America and appealing to the religious right. So why he won? Unlike in Goldwater's time, the U.S. was not in good shape in 1980, economic stagflation and the Iran hostage crisis. Reagan was charming and upbeat. And as I said, Reagan was less candid about his economic program, which he de-emphasized. He said, my program is jobs, jobs, and more jobs. And he benefited from mobilizing the religious right. Well, after two terms of Reagan and one of the first George Bush, Bill Clinton broke the Republicans' three presidential win streak, and he won back Reagan Democrats in large part by neutralizing the Republican advantages on crime and welfare. And I might add, by being a Southerner, but he favored the death penalty, and he announced he was opposing welfare as we know it. And he won back some, but many blue-collar workers were still leaving the Democratic Party. And why? One is racial issues that I discussed earlier, and the second is Democrats' commitment to the environment threatened the jobs of workers in many manufacturing and extractive jobs, about which I'll say more later. And many blue-collar voters are culturally conservative. And in addition, Clinton supported free trade. And many working class people saw this as bad for them and supported some deregulation of business. All of this made it easier for the Republicans to attack the Democrats as the party of the elite and call themselves the party of real Americans. Now here we come to the 21st century, and the three presidents had full terms for it. So one of the things which became really increasingly important in the late 80s and 2000s is religion. I want to talk about American religious exceptionalism. In the US, a much higher percentage of people believe in God and attend worship regularly than in most advanced nations. Around 2005, 86% of Americans believed in heaven, 43% attended religious services weekly. Corresponding numbers in Britain were 54% and 14%. And unlike in Western Europe, the rate of religious beliefs in the US were higher than in the 19th century. So let's say more about conservative evangelical Protestants. They have a literal interpretation of the Bible. They grew in numbers and political activity. They're very strongly anti-abortion, anti-LGBT, for abstinence-only sex education, and often opposed birth control, favored traditional gender roles, and often opposed teaching evolution. They were disproportionately Southern, at least in Southern origin. Nowadays, you have plenty of people who are formerly Southern living in places like Michigan who came here for the good jobs that the Second World War offered. And anyway, these conservative evangelicals, many of whom were apolitical before 1980, became strongly allied with the Republican Party since 1980. Now, the nature of religion and party choice greatly changed. In the past, party choice was primarily by religious difference, Protestant versus Catholic versus Jew. There were still some such differences, but much less than in the past. And I will show you a table of that. What you can see in this table is the Catholics who used to be overwhelmingly Democratic are now less than half Democratic. And that 45% includes a lot of Latino Catholics. The white Catholics are considerably less than 45% Democratic. Jews are down from 90% to 71% Democratic. And you might say, well, looking at all these figures and the fact that Jews are a really small group, how did the Democrats manage to stay competitive at all? And the answer is the none, the unaffiliated, who are 68% Democratic, are an increasingly large group. Why does these things change? Well, Catholics and Jews quite a while ago stopped being low-income groups shut out of access to status and power. And one indicator of that is, look at the Supreme Court. 7 justices are Catholic and 2 are Jewish, which means how many are Protestant? And the other things, people are now responding not in terms of their religious affiliation, but their attitudes regarding policies on race, gender, sexuality, and the environment. And more particularly, the current role of religion is that most religious groups are split. Religiously conservative Protestants, Catholics, and Jews vote Republican. Religiously liberal Protestants, Catholics, and Jews vote Democratic. And secular people, these unaffiliated, vote Democratic. Now, you can see some of this by looking at religious attendance and 2016 presidential vote. Though those who attend weekly, only 40% are Democratic, and that 40% includes a lot of Blacks and Latinos. Those who attend never are 62% Democratic. Now look at race and the 2016 presidential election. And the left column of numbers is the percentage of voters of all voters there are, and the right column is percentage Democrat of the two-party vote. You can see that whites are considerably less than half of them Democratic. The other groups are more than half, especially Blacks. Latinos and Asians are interesting because Latinos are often quite culturally conservative, which is one reason why they don't vote overwhelmingly Democratic some other groups. Latinos are also very much divided by country of origin politically. Asians are mostly, but by no means entirely, Democratic, and they also are divided by countries of origin in different cultures. Okay, so this basically says what I just said looking at the table. Okay, now we turn to gender and voting. And those of you who are old enough may remember that a long time ago, gender had essentially zero association with voting behavior. However, in the 1980 presidential election with Reagan, men were majority Republican, 8% more Republican than women. It translates linguistically, we say there was an 8% gender gap. The gender gap varied between 4% and 8% in the elections pre-Trump, 1984 to 2012. Some people think abortion is the main reason for the gender gap, but it's not. In fact, polls consistently showed that men and women had very similar attitudes about whether they were for allowing it or against it. Although the main difference is for women, it was a more important issue one way or the other. The biggest reasons for the gender gap. The two parties differ on equal pay, on family leave, and now on sexual assault. Presidential election in 2016 showed the biggest gender gap we had observed. Women were 13% more likely to vote Democratic than men, 54% versus 41%. And this is really quite impressive. The voting difference was much bigger among single people than married. Among singles, it was greater than 30%. And as far as reasons why, I think there are two reasons I can think of. One is members of the same couple, because of their relationship with each other, would tend to vote alike. And the other thing is that the income differences between men and women matter most for single people, not for married people. Now, this is the 2020 election. It's the numbers here are the percentage who voted for Biden. Look at both education and gender. So what you can see here is that college grads were considerably more Democratic, 18 or 20% more Democratic than not college graduates, but the women were 6 or 8% more Democratic than men. So what was the difference between 2020 and 2016? In 2020, it should make the turnout rate was higher than any time since 1960, maybe even higher. Comparing with 2016, Trump did worse among college-educated voters, but surprisingly, he did somewhat better among Blacks and Latinx. Some say that someone liked his machismo, even if they didn't like his attitudes toward them. Okay, so getting back to income and other economic factors. From 1932 to 64, income was one of the most important influences on how people voted. Now, if you hold constant three things, race, gender, and education, what you find is income makes very little difference. Or to put it another way, income is correlated some with how you vote, but that can be explained entirely by differences in these other factors, which are more likely the cause. Education, however, has become an important predictor in and of itself. One of the reasons for that is, if not the only one, we'll talk about others, the effect of the environmental politics from around 1970. The environment was initially bipartisan. Nixon actually embraced it to get people away from revolutionary ideas. He thought that was safer. And as you all, people my age probably remember, Nixon signed the Clean Air and Water Act, creating the EPA. But by the 1980s, the Republican leadership was against environmental regulations because they saw them as bad for business. And in the 2000s, climate change denial became standard Republican policy. Now, many blue-collar workers fear that environmental regulations will destroy their jobs, and for that reason, many support and vote for the GOP. You see it most clearly, in West Virginia with coal. But I read a book about whites in New Orleans, and many of them are aware that working with oil and chemicals is bad for their health, but they say, if we don't have them, we don't have jobs at all. Okay. By contrast, many educated, affluent people value the environment, and perhaps equally important, they have jobs that are not threatened by environmental regulation, and for that reason, vote Democratic. Now, the role of education really has changed quite a bit, because when Kennedy won in 1960s, he actually won white voters without a college degree, but lost white college graduates by 2-1. This is, in retrospect, really quite amazing. When Biden, who, unlike Kennedy's with upper class Biden had much more working class background, he lost white voters without a college degree by 2-1, while narrowly winning white college graduates. Now, why most low-income whites vote Republican? Well, there are a number of reasons. Some do not, understand the Democratic policy as there's policies that favor them economically, like offering them better health insurance, among other things. And Fox News helps this misunderstanding by, parroting Republican lines that the tax cuts are mostly for the benefit of ordinary people, and denying that the Republicans exclude pre-existing conditions. Okay? Another thing is, so a lot of working class people get their political, I'd say, miseducation from Fox, etc. And what they don't receive is information from labor unions, which they used to. 1960s, 35% of people, workers were in labor unions versus 11% now. And the 11% who are in now are often public sector white-collar workers rather than blue-collar workers. And of course, you do have conservative religious and social beliefs on, for example, abortion and gender. And interviews found that many of these people view minorities and immigrants as taking what should go to people like them, especially the needier ones among them. And in addition, they often see educated liberals as looking down on them, something that the Republican Party tries to instill in them as a belief. Now, next thing I want to briefly talk about is attitudes towards science and religion. If you look in 1975, you'll see that clear majorities of supporters of both parties had confidence in science. In 1921, Democrats had even more confidence in science. Republicans, less than half had confidence in science. By contrast, in confidence in religion, in 2021, just 26% of Democrats have confidence in organized religion, compared to 51% of Republicans. By contrast, in 1970, Democrats were more confident in religion than Republicans. And what I've just shown you about science and religion reflects the fact that the Republicans increasingly attracted a lower education, more religiously fundamentalist group. And the consequences among them are clashing beliefs of Democrats and Republicans on such issues as climate change and how to deal with COVID. So the summary so far is from 1930 through 1960, voting choice was determined primarily by income and religious affiliations. Now, well, income helps account for Blacks and Latinos voting overwhelmingly Democratic, but voting choice is really determined primarily by racial and ethnic identity, and a whole bunch of what could be classified as social issues, attitudes towards sex and gender, towards guns as part of people's identity, towards the way we teach U.S. racial history, towards climate change and public health. Now, so I'm not talking about polarization and its change. We're mostly done. Right? To show you how relatively unpolarized we were in the past, as I mentioned before, the key Civil Rights Act of 64 and Voting Rights of 65 was supported by most Republicans in Congress. Okay? Nixon and the Republicans in Congress, many, not all, but joined Democrats in major environmental legislation in the early 70s. Nixon in the early 70s proposed a national health care bill, which later Ted Kennedy said, my biggest regret is that I didn't accept it and help pass it. And this is also important as a contrast with what happened recently, when during Watergate, at a certain point, many Republican senators, including Barry Goldwater, decided Nixon had behaved unacceptably, and if he didn't resign, he needed to be removed. And you know the contrast with the present. There was also, as Joe Biden often talks about nostalgically, a congressional culture of civility. People disagreements, but did not make you enemies. He talked about how people had lots of friendships across the aisle. And This is by 2012, well before Trump became a major force. There was a book on polarization called "It's Even Worse Than It Looks: How the American Constitutional System Collided with the New Politics of Extremism." And the two authors, one man is with the Brookings Institute, which is moderately liberal, and Ornstein is with the American Enterprise Institute, which is somewhat conservative. And their conclusion was, while both parties participate in tribal warfare, they are not equally culpable. This is important coming from a Republican like Ornstein. This asymmetric polarization, with the Republican Party refusing to allow anything that might help the Democrats politically, no matter what the cost to the country. Some examples you could give are Mitch McConnell stating as his objective in 2009 to make Obama a one-term president. The frequent refusal to raise debt limits by Republicans, shutting down the government for a while, and many still oppose infrastructure if the Democrats are proposing it. So we saw it happen, that it has happened. Why has it increased so much? Well, one thing, before 1980, there were many moderate and conservative Democrats, especially in the South. And there were many moderate and liberal Republicans, especially in the Northeast. Now, people have resorted themselves, so each party has much less ideological diversity, and part of that also happened in the big Republican victory in the congressional election of 1974. Many conservative Southern Democrats were replaced by far-right Republicans, who provided the basis of the far right today often, although the far right isn't just in the South. As looking at Jim Jordan and others will show us. There are two additional, they're not competing, but additional explanations. The Republican recruitment of religious fundamentalists in the culture war became important. It is harder for people to compromise on cultural issues, which are seen as good versus evil, than on economic issues where it's easier to see ways to split the difference. And then some of the blame for polarization can go, before Trump, can go to Newt Gingrich. Now, Newt Gingrich in the early 90s was very frustrated by the fact that even though the Republicans were winning presidential elections, the Democrats were consistently the majority in the House of Representatives. And he and others decided to do something, and to use language to demonize the Democrats. So to win, Gingrich had the Republicans say, basically engage total war, use language characterizing Democrats as radical, as sick, and as traitors, and as opposing the Democrats on everything, all policies. Now, what are the political consequences of candidates being seen as extreme? Well, Goldwater in 64 and McGovern in 72 were both considered far from the political center, and both lost badly. And after these defeats, both parties, at least in the short run, nominated more moderate candidates. The current GOP is becoming more extreme and has not paid a big price for its extremism. Why not? Well, first, as you all know, our Constitution gives extra state clout to small states via the Senate, and these small states are mostly Republican. And as many of you also know, gerrymandering enhances GOP represented. Now, both parties have gerrymandered when they have the chance, but the Republicans have been more effective at it. And perhaps for that reason, they want to preserve it, while the Democrats in the bills that they've proposed in Congress are saying, let's do away with gerrymandering. In addition, if you look at effects on public opinion, the Republicans make clever use of hot-button cultural issues, as in schools in Virginia. They've also, I mentioned Fox News, they've created a community which totally distrusts mainstream media and what most of us consider facts as a result of Fox News and even further right media. And their messages get amplified by social media, which mass circulates falsehood and creates reinforcing echo chambers. Now, because of polarization, there are many fewer swing voters than in the past, but they are crucial in closely divided electorate. They're often middle income to affluent whites. And in Virginia, a few weeks ago, Republicans won them by talking about teaching race in the schools. Now, much of what I've said in the past makes clear that my sympathies are far more with Democrats than Republicans, but I will say something critical of Democrats, which some of my audience may not agree with. Okay? I think that there are some Democratic actions and messages play into Republican hands. So it is one thing, and I think appropriate, to tell people about racist policies that contributed to the enormous gap in wealth that we have and the need to change such policy. And also appropriate to acknowledge the slaveholding among many founding fathers. But it is another thing to ignore the fact that Thomas Jefferson and other founders also did some very great things. Like Jefferson was a great proponent, not only had ideas about, even if he didn't follow them, about equality, but was a very strong proponent of religious freedom and public education. And in addition, this happens often in universities where people get canceled for statements that seem insufficiently anti-racist. And it is one thing to say that policing needs reforming, and it is another to call for defunding police, something many Black people oppose. And Al Sharpton, a Black leader, said, "Where I come from, people are afraid of both the cops and the robbers." And we need police for that. So I'm not aware of any leading Democratic politicians saying these things. Others do say these things, and when they do, they help Republicans who seize onto them. The future. Well, let me quote Casey Stengel, who said, "It is very difficult to make correct predictions, especially about the future." And so, following Stengel's advice, I am not making predictions. I am simply asking questions. Will the infrastructure law and Build Back Better, if it passes, benefit enough low and middle income whites to make these people more favorable to the Democrats? Or will cultural issues and identity politics keep such people with the Republican Party and lead to further Republican victories, as in Virginia in 2021? And I'll leave you with that question, and we shall see. And I'd like to thank all those who stayed with me. So now it's time for people to ask questions. How do we do that?
Yes. Could you unshare?
What?
Share your.
Can I unshare it?
Or you just stop share? No.
Ed's up.
Okay.
How do we find that out? Okay, can John Waller be heard by the audience?
With an echo.
Yeah. I'm here. Let me give you guys.
We can.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So yeah, please put any questions in the chat box, or just raise your hand.
Yeah, okay. There's David.
Maybe I can start off with a question.
Okay, that's fine.
I'm reading at the moment a book entitled Democracy in America by Martin Gillum. And what he shows is that if you compare education and healthcare, most American voters are hugely more progressive than either their party or the millionaire or billionaire without this office.
Can't hear a thing.
Can't hear you, John.
John's very muffled.
I hope they were able to hear me, although they. Yeah, we're muted.
Okay, is that any better?
Maybe those two computers are too close to each other. Wait, maybe.
Okay, is that any better?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, excellent.
Great.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, let me. I'll ask my question later, Stan. Jennifer asks, you noted that the GOP makes clever use of hot button cultural issues. I don't see the remainder of a question there, Jennifer. Do you want to?
No, I'm sorry. I hit the return button too soon. My question is, my impression is that Democrats are remarkably bad at selling what I think of as really remarkably good proposals, like the healthcare proposal under Obama. Is my perception valid? I mean, Fox News seems to be very, very powerful, but I don't see a counter to that in the popular media to help Democrats make their case more persuasively.
I think that's often true. That Democrats and when.
I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
Okay. Okay, can you hear me now?
I can, thank you.
Okay, so you've made it. I'm hearing myself twice, but you've made a good point. One of the problems Democrats have is that what Democrats want to do is to balance competing values. Democrats want to help people, but Democrats do not want to totally take over the economy. And the very Democrat, in terms of healthcare, a transition to Medicare for all would be very difficult, as well as being opposed by all the important interests. But Obamacare, or Affordable Care Act, was extremely complicated and difficult to explain. And even what I said, in terms of race and policing, it may be more difficult, more complicated, and more difficult to explain than a lot of people want to deal with. The Republicans have the ability to make things very simple. So I think that's part of what goes on.
Mm-hmm.
So I noticed it says, doesn't climate change trump all other issues? Well, one can certainly make a case that it is the most important thing. On the other hand, I'd say, while voters care more about it than in the past, over half are seriously concerned. That doesn't mean that all these people are willing to make significant sacrifices. At least in the short term, what they are more concerned about is other things. A good example from France came a number of blue-collar workers were saying, Macron is worried about the end of the world, but we are worried about the end of the month.
Yeah.
And that's
Yeah.
probably true of many Americans as well. Or also, even if they care about climate change, are not ready to get rid of their entire lifestyle. It's built upon fossil fuels.
Even though it would be possible to suggest alternatives, that it doesn't
Okay.
have to be
So,
either or.
Next, I don't see anything else in the chat. Others want to raise their hand? Or Nancy? Can you unmute yourself, Nancy?
You've described very well shifts in voter determinants. And
I still can't hear you.
well, then we won't work. It won't work, I guess. Can anyone else hear me?
I can hear you.
You can't hear me, Stan?
I can hear you. You could put your question in a chat.
It's
perhaps.
a long question. Essentially what I'm asking is, how do the shifts in voting determinants, which you've described, parallel or differ from the shifts in voting determinants in countries that have turned to fascism or authoritarianism?
Well, there are certainly similarities in terms of, leaders who tell the low-income people that they're being basically mistreated, ignored, etc., by liberal elites. Yeah, so there definitely are similarities. Particularly in a number of Eastern European countries, that's very much the case. I can't comment in more detail on that. So I noticed a good comment from Arthur, who said some conservatives see economic issues such as welfare as cultural and moral. They don't want to encourage idleness. That certainly is a way that many people think about it. And in terms of my own assessment, my understanding is that some of the Scandinavian states actually reached the point of generosity where some of them said, we need to be less generous because we are encouraging idleness by how generous we are. But the US is very far from that. And I know that, well, I won't say that welfare never encourages idleness, but I will say more specifically about the current situation that there was recently a natural experiment in terms of some states were cutting back on payments to people from the rescue plan and others were not. And the findings were people's willingness to go back to work did not depend on whether they were receiving this extra income or not. So the extra income that many people in the country got was not working as a disincentive. Other thing? David, anyway.
Yes, thanks so much, Stan, for this excellent perspective. I have another question, though. I remember Clinton saying it's the economy, stupid, everything depends upon the economy. And now people are talking about inflation and how that's really starting to drive issues and so on. But I think also another issue, so that's one kind of question, you can comment on that. But the other issue is the sense of government controlling people. And all the culture wars are around government telling us what to do, whether we should wear masks or not, whether gay trans person can go into a men's bathroom or a woman's bathroom, whether what we teach in our schools and who determines what we teach in our schools. So to what degree has that been part of the politics in the past where people have felt that the government is telling them what to do as opposed to making decisions around economic issues or more policy issues?
Thank you, David. So I would say whenever the government tries to tell people to do what they don't want, they object to government control and often make an issue of it. So, and that you're certainly right about those particular examples in terms of masking, etc. Although, I will say that there weren't anti-vaxxers in big way with polio or measles vaccine. It really is a much more recent thing in connection with this. I'm trying to remember. Oh, I would also say that one thing, of course, that's inconsistent on the right is they have no problem with government telling women that they can't have abortions. Or they're very pro-life when it comes to the unborn. And, you know, I've often been saying, well, who's pro-life with COVID? Yeah, I don't know whether I think there may have been something else you said that I missed responding to. Is there?
Well, it was a complicated question. I think you handled it nicely.
Okay, thank you. Okay. James Anderson.
Yes, I'd like to thank you for the talk. You covered a large period of American history in about 40 minutes or so. Just a couple questions. One, it seems to me where we're at this point in time is a question of the political dimensions of what's going to be the structure of the government going forward. Seems more and more people are shaking the foundations, constitutional foundations, and are willing to go beyond them to look at authoritarian government as opposed to government of limited powers, 3 co-branches of government, and the belief in electoral system and turning the government over on a bipartisan basis. I mean, not resort to violence to take over the government. So perhaps your talk in the future might have to go back to the Civil War in some way to look at this modern situation as I look at it. Aside from that, the second question is, we had the modern period here looking at Fox News, but it seems to me to understand 2016 election and 2020, we have to look at our technological structures. I mean, Facebook and other organizations, their social platforms, and how people are getting their opinions from them. And yet we've had a lot of criticism now of Facebook, their algorithms, what they permit to go on online to influence this. And I realize this is new and you can't take it back. This is technology that wasn't in the 1930s where we started this talk, but I'm interested in getting your ideas on these two areas where we're at right now. And
One of them you talked about it. Well, okay, two things. One is I share your worry about whether our democracy will survive or whether we are on the verge of another civil war. Okay, that's the first thing. Regarding the social media and their use, I do think that a lot of what goes on in social media is similar to shouting fire in a crowded theater. I'm reading a book called Liars and Hype by Cass Sunstein. I haven't gotten as far as I'd like to, even though it's a thin book, but very dense. But he tries to propose ways of basically dealing with dangerous lies on the one hand, but preserving freedom of speech on the other hand. But I haven't read enough of it to be able to give you an answer. Now, I do notice it's one person, Matthews, asked me, do you feel a third party could ever have a chance in U.S. politics? And my answer is not until we change our way of voting for Congress. As long as one person gets elected and from each state or each district, the third party is inevitably going to hurt, the party you don't want to, you'd rather not hurt. So no, I don't, you know, yeah.
I have been involved in other elections for 70 years. And business of healthcare has come up in this question on multiple occasions tonight. I'm wondering if people would say whether really a problem healthcare is nominating the discussion period of the transition. And it's such a way that two enormous corporate another one in China, another one in Detroit. And these are not being discussed as potential bellwethers or you cannot get a doctor today. You cannot do somebody working in healthcare, and I know that but what's going on here, you have these huge social processes. I know it's upside down, different language. Like talking Chinese, English, to French, Latin, and that sort of thing. And not 200 and everything that I came to the university in medical. Is there anybody out there that started medical school? We're not teaching anything like we taught this year.
Okay.
Nobody's talking about that. There is a social thing because the fact that we're, for example,
Yeah.
So your water story, like a tell from the second television and harder. And they all look at the road completely differently. And they are have been able to figure this out to work best for their population. And we don't.
Yeah.
You know, we're talking about the right things, you know, just one way to talk. Right here in Lansing.
Yeah. People, I've forgotten your name.
Pardon me?
Yeah, you are.
What the sociologist.
Yes, but I, you know, I can't. We have to talk about it greatly, and I haven't been thinking. Yeah, I can't give you a simple answer, but sociologists do deal with healthcare quite a bit. Yeah. So, if there's anyone else in, my own suggestion is that if anyone in the existing audience wants to ask a question now, they should probably come up to here to do so, right?
Yeah,
because in order to be heard.
It's really sort out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Professor, your data spoke about the extent to which people are backing away from a belief in science. And there's probably no answer for this, so hey, I'll ask you. Is there something or some things that replace that? I mean, are we waiting for the cult leader to tell us the truth, or Fox News, or the church?
Well, yeah.
Thanks.
But that's the simple answer, more than in the past. We need to improve science education, clearly. But, one of the things is people have to be receptive to you. In one article, it's focusing on southern, the rural people in Virginia said Democrats could present policies that benefit them economically, but many of them are in no position to want to listen. They basically do not trust Democrats. Democrats are not people like them who respect people not people who respect them, etc. So they won't believe anything the Democrats say about how they'll help them.
So there were a couple of questions in the chat.
Oh, okay.
Matthew.
Yeah, I answered Matthew.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, Matthews. I said basically that, third party is not going to work as long as we keep our voting system. Multiple parties sometimes work when you have proportional representation. One place where a third party has survived, but really shows how it doesn't work. Britain has single member constituents the way we do, and they have a liberal democratic party, which is ideologically in between conservative and labor. And they get a decent amount of votes, but their proportion of seats in parliament is way less than their proportion of the vote, which can show you elsewhere what happens to third parties.
That was a word in question for
me. Okay.
Would you want to read the question answer?
Your question. Okay, I have to find it. No. Okay, Martin Gillens argues that the American public is generally far more favor spending on schools, university access, and job creation. But he points out this is seldom reflected in laws and policies which more closely reflect the interest of very rich political backers. To the extent this is true, what can be done to increase the political voice of the median voter? A very good question. Okay, so, well, but one thing I do have to say in terms of interpreting surveys, though, is surveys before the Clinton plan, before affordable health care, really was constantly telling us that most Americans wanted universal health insurance to improve it. But when you actually get a proposal out there, Republicans are able to basically talk it to death. And one of the reasons is it's complicated, but the other reason is it's one thing to want something, it's another thing to be willing to accept any trade-offs in the pursuit of getting it. So, in some of the cases, people say, oh, I want this thing, but you say, oh, it'll have more government involvement and you will be inconvenienced you in some way. And that can often talk people out of it unless you actually demonstrate to get it to happen and demonstrate it'll work. But getting it to happen is often very hard, given the difficulty in persuading members of Congress to take the risk. But I mean, the one thing I can think of, which would certainly increase the political voice of the median voter versus the rich, would be ending Citizens United. However, I get what's the chance of ending Citizens United? Passing a constitutional amendment to end it? Impossible. Given the Republican opposition to doing that. Congress, I think, basically passed laws restricting contributions from the rich, and the Supreme Court stopped it. So you need a string of Democratic victories to change the Supreme Court. Some of the, which is difficult under the current circumstances. Anyway, anyone else out in Zoom land with questions? It's been great having all of you here.
Yeah.
Here, both here and in Zoom land.
Mind to grab your computer a second?
Sure.
Yes. Thank you again, everybody, for attending, and apologies once more for our technical difficulty. We'll eventually.
Thank you, Stan. It was really a great summary and presentation, thoughtful. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Please join us next week when Dr. Susan
Thank you very much, Stan. It was wonderful.
Thank you.
Yes,
Okay, thank
Nigel
you.
from London
Thank you.
Thank you, Nigel.
and Berry.
Thank you, Stan. You sent us off with lots to think about.
Okay.